Too Much Information is a production of iHeart.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Too Much Information, the show that brings you the secret histories and little-known fascinating facts and figures behind your favorite movies, music, TV shows, and more. We are your two vegans of verisimilitude, your DJs of the deep dive, your archival recordings of ancient recitations. That one was a stretch, and I'm not vegan. I'm Alex Heigl.
And I'm Jordan Runtagh, and wow, you really tried for that one. You really strove.
Yeah, you know, sometimes I work up the energy.
To use the phrase that just came into my vernacular, that ate. Am I using that properly? It sounds slightly obscene.
Did I leave no crumbs? I'm actually eating a cookie for breakfast.
Oh, I feel really bad now. Is leaving no crumbs, is that an expression?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know that.
It's an off branch of they ate.
Ah.
Like ate the whole thing, you know?
Oh, I see. I don't know the context.
You got to be on Twitter more. That's how I get all this stuff. People say it's TikTok, but...
Drag Race Twitter?
Today, Jordan, we are talking about one of the highest selling and certainly most sold out records of all time, Moby's Play, which turned 25 this year. Of course, I remember this record because it was everywhere. You could not escape it. It was in stores, movies, TV shows, multiple commercials. You could literally not escape it. You know, my biggest memory of this is Natural Blues because Vera Hall Ward's voice is so like haunting, and he didn't really do anything other than put a bunch of synths around it. Anyway, we'll get into the ethics of all this, but yeah, I just remember that song and that video, and I didn't even know what sampling really was. So I was like, I assumed it was a live singer, you know, and I was wrong, obviously, but I just remember being so taken with her voice. And then when I got to college and started diving into like pre-war blues and folk music and particularly the work of Alan Lomax, you know, that never left me. And I saw this anniversary coming up, and not out of any particular love of the Mobster or this album, I pitched this to you because I'm going to backdoor it an enormous chunk of information about celebrated folklorist and ethnomusicologist Alan Lomax into the middle of this episode. That's right, folks. Deal with it. I'm going to talk about Alan Lomax for a while and completely leave the world of Moby behind. So, I don't know, spoilers, skip around. Maybe we can put timestamps in if people don't care about Alan Lomax. But he's more interesting than Moby by a damn sight, I'll tell you that much.
Yeah, I mean, I have to be honest. When you first mentioned doing this album, I was absolutely baffled, and I actually thought you were messing with me. I mean, it was like, you know, how about we do an episode on Pure Moods? Which
we should.
We probably should. That compilation means an awful lot to a lot of people who are dear to me. So I think that could also do quite well. You know, in retrospect, maybe this should have been a Pure Moods episode. We just had a long tangent on, because isn't Porcelain on that? I think Porcelain's on
Probably.
that. Yeah.
You know, in fairness, sorry, I got to finish chewing before I talk. I heard some chewing on the other episode, and I got so angry with myself.
As your de facto producer, I should probably give you a heads up. I'm sorry. Chewing, grabbing the mic and doing this as you talk, typing. Yeah.
But this is when I grab the mic, this is for effect, you know.
No, there's a lot of where you get so excited where you grab the mic and do this. And like I hear the like, and I try to cut around it. But it's like, it's really like endearing, so I never want to tell you about it. But 152 episodes in, I thought
maybe this time I'll tell him. No, I have to confess that like 25 years later, when I'm like, now that I'm into like ambient music and a lot of minimalist stuff, I actually have to say there's some heaters on this album. I mean, there's a reason it's so damn popular. I mean, it's all innocuous and fairly like, I mean, we'll talk about this later, but fairly low effort musically, not in terms of like the labor that went into it, because he was doing all this pre-computers. He was just doing this with a bunch of samplers, but like, you know, he didn't like reharmonize these songs. He just draped them in a bunch of single finger synth lines.
That's so funny that you mentioned this being ubiquitous and, reading your outline and seeing all the syncs that it got in commercials and movies.
Over 100.
That's
in the
insane.
course of a year.
I have almost no memory of this other than seeing the poster for the album cover in like an FYE or Sam Goodies or something. Yeah, I don't. I mean, granted, I was not exactly on the cutting edge of music in 1999 when I was 12, but
right.
It's so funny. Where would you encounter this? Like, what were your interactions with this as a tween?
It was all over the box, which was the
pre-MTV2.
Yeah, so and all the videos for this were directed by like celebrated people like David LaChapelle and Roman Coppola.
Oh, wow. Oh, I didn't know that.
So I saw the videos quite a bit, particularly South Side, where Gwen Stefani looks like, I hate that song. That song is dumb.
Oh, I like that song. That's the only one I like because it's dumb and I don't have sophisticated music taste.
But Gwen Stefani is so hot in that music video. That made quite an impression on me as a youngster. No, I just, that was like the first place. And then through osmosis, just like being in the drugstore and being in a Sam Goody,
Hearing the Alan Lomax connection for this album really put it in perspective for me why you wanted to do this. It's interesting. I don't know if I ever told you about this. It reminds me of this project that I was working on a few years ago. The gentleman who runs the Dust to Digital Twitter and Instagram account came to us at iHeart, and he wanted to do a show. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Dust to Digital account, it is incredible. It is just, he's I think he's an archivist down in Georgia, and he posts these amazing clips from around the world. People send him stuff from everywhere. You get everything from a guy playing a McDonald's straw like a flute so well that it makes you want to cry, to women in Africa standing in a river playing the water surface like a drum, which is just absolutely mind-blowing. And then you've got some guy in the American South playing a cigar box guitar, and then a clip of Carla Thomas on some regional TV show in the 60s. I mean, he just has the most fascinating spectrum of music from everywhere. And he's just so cool. Everyone go check out Dust to Digital. And he pitched us a podcast that we actually put together a pilot for, which was like a tone poem for the development of music and the cross-pollination of sounds across the world. And it was pretty cool. Every episode was going to be a different theme. Like, I think the pilot we did was the body as an instrument. And it was just people making these incredible sounds with like hand rhythms and whistling and I think bone flutes and things like that too, which technically body's an instrument. It was really cool, but it was a little too out there, and we didn't move forward with it at the network, which I'm very sad about. But his account is so cool. Again, check it out.
Yeah, and the crazy thing about YouTube, at least, is that the Lomax archive, which we'll get into, is now part of the Library of Congress, has some tremendous video stuff that was shot, like R.L. Burnside, like a very young R.L. Burnside playing, and all like shaped note congregations singing. It's just people who are just curious about music and maybe, I'm gonna get corny here, like feel a yearning for like an older style of music and a different world that this music was being created in. It is just it's like a time machine, and it's incredible. Moby, though. That guy's
the Moby of it all. Yeah.
That guy sucks. It's funny because for me, it didn't take until like the past few years when cultural appropriation really became a thing for me to be like, kind of weird that this annoying little bald guy vegan made like an ungodly amount of money by using a bunch of black people's voices. But yeah, obviously that conversation has only gotten more pointed and heated. And I will say that despite his talent, the guy hasn't done himself any favors, man. He keeps just popping up in the news for saying dumb shit.
Yeah.
It's like, I can't get quite a handle on what is precisely wrong with him. But maybe we'll get to it.
Yeah, I mean, that was a conversation that we explicitly had on this Dust to Digital pilot, because we played some of the field recordings and kind of used that as a jumping off point to talk about how, this music can sometimes yield unexpected results, like this Moby hit.
Yeah, I mean, some of these women were born in 1902. That's like and their parents were slaves, and it's just incredible that you have them singing through history in this way.
Yeah.
And it sucks that he made so much money from it, and apparently did not give them any, or even mention them by name ever, and in fact misidentify some of them, as we will also get into. Well, from Moby's tragic backstory, to the Lomaxes and the Library of Congress collections they're responsible for, to the bizarre nature of copyright and sampling law, illustrated by the fact that Alan Lomax has a credit on a Jay-Z song, to the exact whereabouts of the CD box set loaned to Moby that jump-started this whole damn thing, here's everything you didn't know about Moby's play. Moby was born Mobile Bumblebee in 1965, taking his stage name by combining the two. No, I'm sorry, I'm just now hearing that's wrong. His name is Richard Melville Hall, and he took his stage name, of course, from Herman Melville's Moby Dick. However, despite this being a frequently repeated part of his lore that he's distantly related to Herman Melville, I don't believe that that's true. There was like a genealogy podcast or a project that I found that actually contends that he is related to David Melville, inventor of the first United States patented in the U.S. gaslight system.
That's kind of cool. Did he? Yeah. He must have started the Herman Melville rumor himself. That seems like something he would do.
I don't know. Yeah. I mean, despite his bookish demeanor and easy listening vibes, Moby's life was kind of his dad died in a drunken car crash 3 days after he was born. 3 days. And his single mother struggled to make ends meet and raise her son in locales like San Francisco, where he would later recall being sexually abused by a staff member at his daycare, and a squat in Darien, Connecticut, living with, as he later told The Guardian, 3 or 4 other drug-addicted hippies with bands playing in the basement.
I mean, that all sounds awful, showing compassion, but are there squats in Darien, Connecticut? That's like...
Couldn't tell you, bud.
That's like Greenwich. That's like Beverly Hills. That's like...
I mean, every city's got a poor part. I don't know. I mean, yeah, like, you're right. Like, obviously, the whole Natalie Portman thing, he showed his ass.
He plays fast and loose with his past. I think he's... I don't know. I start to wonder about his Dickensian upbringing, but...
Within the context of that, yeah. Well, young Mobile took up music and notched some impressive creds. When he was 18, he was the lead singer for SF punk legends Flipper for all of 2 days.
Sorry, I just want to say, in 2019, the median household income for Darien, Connecticut was $250,000.
Okay, well, what was it in 1970?
All right, fine. I
love that you're already knives out for Richard.
Yeah, this is the most aggressive I've ever gotten on this show.
Hey, maybe you'll get some nasty Apple Podcast reviews about you.
You think I would be much more...
And your bad energy.
You think I would be much more lenient and a nerdy nebbishy dude who delves into archives.
Well, he's got that thing that Orson Welles famously said about Woody Allen, which is that his meekness is actually arrogance.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. You know, I know we've both talked about a shared history on our couches watching the various VH1 programming countdowns of the early to mid 2000s. And I remember there's an episode, I think it's either there are 2 that are burned in my mind. There's 100 Greatest Artists of Hard Rock, hosted by Carmen Electra in a leather dress. And there's the 40 Most Shocking Moments in Rock and Roll, hosted by Mark McGrath in a leather jacket.
In a leather face.
That didn't happen until recently.
Oh, yeah.
What's that Simpsons line when they're watching Troy McClure and the Muppets? Daddy, why is that Muppet's face made out of leather? Anyway, there's one of them where Moby is talking about Kurt Cobain and he uses the word insouciance.
Oh, yeah. And he's got the chyron that like defines it.
Brings up the chyron with the definition of the word.
Just to dunk on him. I mean, the only time I've ever like intentionally watched anything with Moby being interviewed was an episode of Nevermind the Buzzcocks, which is my beloved British music-centric panel show, Pop Quiz. And he was on there, and he spent most of the time just talking about how everyone hates him, and just made it like an ongoing joke about how like the world hates him.
Oh yeah, he's very sensitive about that.
And we are not.
He also started his own punk band, AWOL, around this time.
AWOL, not a wall, which would be really that would be a much more Moby name.
That would be kind of a sick punk band name.
A wall?
A wall?
Yeah.
Yeah. AWOL. AWOL. I don't know. That's a regional accent thing. I can't shake it. He joined the Connecticut punk band Vatican Commandos for at least one EP. So this is interesting because some of his career pivots in the 90s are informed by his background in hardcore punk.
Connecticut punk band? That's like Vegan Hunter. Like what? Come on. I'm sorry. I'm not trying to dunk on Connecticut now. Some of my best friends are from Connecticut. But come on. I mean, you're a punk guy. Is there a thriving hardcore Connecticut punk scene?
There's a lot of hardcore that comes from the Northeast, particularly Massachusetts.
Sure.
I don't know how much else of it has. Let me just look up Connecticut punk bands and just see what we got. Hatebreed.
Okay.
Youth of Today, pioneering hardcore band. Vatican Commandos are listed on here. Dashboard Confessional.
Oh, come on.
So it's a slim list, we'll just say. But they existed. Representation matters. Anyway, so he started DJing also. He dropped out of college in 1984 and began DJing around Greenwich and Stamford. Blah, blah, blah. I moved to New York, etc., and so forth. Squalor. He talks a lot about hanging out at Mars Bar, which may be a familiar signpost to you. It's where people who were already old when I moved to Brooklyn talked about their glory days.
I remember Mars Bar.
His first big break was with Go, a track that, in keeping with his later work, is built on someone else's work. Its entire harmonic framework is the two chords of Angelo Badalamenti's theme from Twin Peaks. Released in 1991, it peaked at number 10 in the UK in October and earned him national exposure there. He made an appearance on Top of the Pops, and from there his career kind of started, which would later be a false start, but started to pick up. He collaborated on remixes with the likes of Soundgarden and Billy Corgan. It's hilarious that he's friends with Soundgarden. They took him on tour. I don't know. Electronic music is not really my forte, but I believe you can contextualize a lot of this in the big rise of, I'm just going to say electronica, meaning anything based in like drum machines, synths, and samples. I know that this is a disservice to the entire world of electronic music and all of its many, many subgenres, but I think the quick thumbnail sketch of it in context is as follows. There's a lot of U.S. people who have obviously gotten written out of it, like Frankie Knuckles and a lot of black people, a lot of black DJs. But in the UK, I think you can trace it a lot to, as we just talked about in the Joy Division episode, Factory Records and the kind of breakbeat scene that sprung up in northern Manchester. And our breakbeat probably didn't start in Manchester. See, this was what I was worried about. Electronic music people are deadly serious about their subgenres. And I think I'm making a hash of it. But it was big in Britain, and a lot of those acts started to filter over to the US. This is where you get like the early rave scene, and everybody's on MDA or MDMA and squats and warehouses and I think this is most typified by that like 5-year chunk of time when you had like, was it the Dust Brothers who scored Fight Club?
That I don't know.
I think the soundtrack for Requiem for a Dream has a bunch of like breakbeats on it. Obviously Daft Punk are breaking around this time. Portishead, Chemical Brothers,
Aphex Twins?
Yeah, Aphex Twin, singular, one guy.
Excuse me.
But it's a lot of like, that sound.
Massive Attack.
Massive Attack, sure. I think they're more down tempo, which is also what Moby gets looped into. But again, the goddamn subgenres, I have no idea. Anyway, so this is the context in which Moby was ascended, and things kind of proceeded apace for him. He signed to Elektra in 1993 in the US and Mute Records in the UK, and his first single, Move, parentheses, You Make Me Feel So Good, parentheses closed, reached number 1 on the US Billboard Hot Dance Play Chart and number 21 in the UK. That year, he also toured with Aphex Twin and could not abide with Mr. Twin's smoking habit. So he elected to fly to each gig instead of take the tour bus, which is hilarious given how hardcore he is about veganism and climate change. And apparently at this point in his career was not concerned with the relative difference in carbon emissions between a plane and a bus, which, as you can imagine, are vast.
The Mobsters' next album, Everything Is Wrong, was released in March 1995. Spin magazine named it Album of the Year, though it failed to crack the Billboard 200 or have an impact on the dance charts. Moby's tour for the album included headline spots on the second stage at the 1995 Lollapalooza Festival, and he was feted as the next big thing in the dance electronica club whatever genre. Your words.
Dude, there's so much.
know.
There's down tempo, there's breakbeat, there's happy hardcore, there's like
New Jack
just
Swing? Is that different?
I don't think so, but maybe. Who's to say? Sure, New Jack Swing is electronica.
Should we make an electronica genre right now? We probably could. Who's to stop us? Who's to say?
Who's to say? Piss. Jump.
Yeah. Okay, go make some sounds right now. I mean, all I can think of is Super Hans from Peep Show.
Yeah.
And Jess. Yeah.
This is outrageous. This is contagious. Yeah. This is outrageous. This is contagious. Ooh, feel it. Yeah, feel it.
Yeah, I mean, that's, dude, UK, yeah. This is just like, I just think of like sallow men with bad teeth in parkas when I think of like the UK electronica scene. There go the Apple Podcast reviews.
our new friends in the UK.
Yeah, sorry guys.
The LA Times back in 1995 said Moby was, quote, poised for greatness. And Billboard declared him King of Techno. What an awful title. What an awful lineage. Courtney Love approached Moby to produce her next whole album, but he declined and became
phrasing.
But he declined to work with Courtney Love and became disillusioned with his newfound fame and made his next album a hard pivot. He called it Animal Rights, which is hilarious, and it was a guitar-driven rock record that alienated his fans of softer ambient tracks. Moby himself called it weird, long, self-indulgent, and difficult. Many of those words apply to him. By way of a for instance, the lead single from Animal Rights was a cover of That's When I Reach for My Revolver, named for a quote by Nazi poet Hans Jost by cult post-punk band Mission of Burma.
Yeah, it's the quote is something about it's actually the song title is actually a misnomer. The actual quote is something like, when I begin to think of the word culture, that's when I unholster my Browning, or something. Anyway, yeah. What do you think about that? I admire the perversity of it, I'll say.
Sure. I mean, it almost seems like a Lou Reed-esque, like, willful driving a career into a mountain.
He has mentioned Metal Machine music in some interviews about this, unsurprisingly.
When did Metal Machine music come out?
That's a great question. 75.
Oh, that early. Wow. And that's the one where he just let his guitars feed back and went out and
in an empty
had a
studio.
smoke.
Yeah.
And came back. He was not even in the studio, right? Didn't he leave?
I don't know, actually. Yeah, that was after Sally Can't Dance, which is his one of his worst records.
He was like, oh, he didn't like that? How about this?
Yeah.
Hits guitar in front of amp.
It was definitely in his like fallow era, because
Ditch
before that
period.
it was Rock and Roll Animal, which is the live record he cut with the guys who were later in Alice Cooper's band. It sounds nothing like him. It's kind of a great record though. Those guys are all monsters. Berlin before that, but Berlin, as they say. Berlin. Anyway, go on.
After the backlash to Moby's Animal Rights, he released a compilation of his film score work and asked to be released from his deal with Elektra Records. That's how you know you're just burning through your contract. Here's a compilation of my film scores. Can we wrap this up, please?
I guess he I think he said he was dropped, but I don't know. It doesn't matter. None of this matters.
Moby told Rolling Stone of this period, I was opening for Soundgarden and getting thrown at me every night on stage. However, he did get fan mail about animal rights from Terrence Trent D'Arby, Axl Rose, and Bono, which we guess is a good thing in the mid-90s, right?
Apparently, he cited it as a good sampling of favorable opinions. Sounds embarrassing. If those three people wrote me and told me I was doing a good job, I would seriously question my work.
He added, I did my own tour and was playing to roughly 50 people a night.
Oh my God, bitch.
About how many people did we play to?
At our worst, like 2. On average, 9.
Both of our girlfriends.
Yeah. And the guys in the other band.
Yeah.
Sometimes. A lot of the time, they did not watch us.
Sometimes if we were playing the bowling alley, they were rolling.
Yeah.
But Moby, much like us, was not in a good place. His mom had died of lung cancer, and he was drinking heavily and having panic attacks before going on stage. He initially started work on what would become Play with the intention that it would be his last album, and he thought about going back to school to study what else? Architecture. For some reason, that's just the way that he makes these, like, I think I remember hearing Pink Floyd's later era music being described as large architectural blocks of sound. And that's always how I felt about Moby's stuff in this era, too.
Yeah, this is a bit of a tangent. You can cut it, but I've always thought of electronic music as being built vertically rather than horizontally because
I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah, I mean, at least in digital audio workstations, not back in the day when he was just chaining samplers together, but in digital audio workstations, it's, you're just stacking different effects and different synth washes and drum layers over one thing. And it doesn't, the idea of it, I guess because it doesn't change it in their loops, the idea of it is it doesn't feel as much of a progression to me. I have no problem with this genre. I'm not investigating it, but I don't hate it as much as a lot of people do. I mean, I do hate dubstep, and I do hate the rise of, like, f***ing David Guetta, who we will get to this later. But, David Guetta.
I used to get stopped by people thinking I was him at airports.
I mean, that could have worked out with you in some ways, but...
Spoiler alert, it did not.
How do you say quickie? In the bathroom? God, that guy sucks. Moby described the inspiration for Play thusly. My friend Dimitri Ehrlich, who is a music journalist here in New York, got this Alan Lomax box set. That is incorrect. As we will find out later, it was his younger brother, Gregor.
This box set was like, musical touchstone for, I mean, pretty much kicked off the folk boom. I guess we'll probably talk about this later.
Yeah.
In the late 50s, early 60s. I mean,
yeah.
Bob Dylan based his entire, like, early part of his career on this.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of the sort of big texts of the folk boom were two things. One was this Alan Lomax box set that came out via Atlantic and Prestige, which was like a 12 LP set, and then Harry Partch's The Anthology of American Folk Music, which is a little bit weirder, some more avant-garde stuff. Not avant-garde, but just some less mainstream stuff. And yeah, I mean, there are actually recordings of Bob Dylan and Alan Lomax, like, hanging out, and Bob's, like, playing Masters of War for him, and then they talk about it. The stuff is all online. I mean, when you spend your whole life recording everything around you, you amass a pretty big archive. The box set, anyway, he said Ehrlich had listened to it and wasn't that interested in it, and he gave it to me, and I heard all these great acapellas. The box set specifically was Sounds of the South, a musical journey from the Georgia Sea Islands to the Mississippi Delta.
Songs of the South.
I mean, yeah. Song of the South is, of course, the famously racist Disney movie that Zippity Doo-Dah comes from and has been completely disappeared by them. Because it pictures the slaves as happy and singing and all these other, like, racist overtones, but isn't that the big thing about it?
Yep.
Yeah. Everyone look up Song of the South. Disney doesn't want you to. Lomax's work was essentially just exploring and documenting music from parts of America and other parts of the world as well. He was just really the taper, let's just say. But aside from that essential work, he is kind of a talent agent. He and his dad were for, like, this huge chunk of mid-century American music. I mean, they, quote unquote, discovered artists like Robert Johnson, Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, Burl Ives, Lead Belly, and Muddy Waters. this is kind of a misnomer because obviously a lot of these people were well known in their regions, but because of the position with the Library of Congress and their ins with the different radio programming, the Lomaxes really did break these people nationally and internationally in ways that they never would have just playing around. They never would have gotten the chance had they just kept playing around, Louisiana and Texas. There are some knocks against the Lomaxes, particularly that Alan in particular favored recording conditions and performances that sort of reinforce the exoticization of the musicians. Like, he was a big proponent of recording outside and getting the sounds of nature in there. And he frequently allowed them to get drunk, or in fact just got them drunk for recording sessions to kind of have add a more authentic feel to it. So there's that. But I still would argue that he is the most influential academic and researcher of the 20th century, and maybe all time, because you cannot, the entire landscape of 20th century music in America and Britain, you cannot divorce it from his work. Because this early stuff was coming out on wax cylinders, but then this box set in particular, as we'll mention later, Atlantic Records bankrolled. So he got good recording equipment. Some of these recordings still sound great. And when it was released, it just spread so far and wide. And between the stuff from the Mississippi Delta region that he got and the stuff from, let's just say, the more white music that he got, everything in the second half of the 20th century is influenced by that. Anybody who, country rock, folk rock, obviously the folk boom, but also all of rock and roll. You don't get rock and roll without the Delta blues, and you don't get people in Britain hearing about the Delta blues and then stealing it without Alan Lomax. So, when you quantify his influence and reach in that way, he might be the most famous researcher of at least non-scientific of all time, and people don't really know who he is except for nerds. So obviously I'm quite enamored of his work, but you were saying?
Extremely well said, especially considering most of that was off the dome. Wow. Born in Texas in 1915 to a concert pianist mother and a prominent musicologist father, like you mentioned, Alan Lomax came by his interest in folk music naturally. At age 17, he took a break from his studies and joined his dad on folk song collecting field trips, which we'll talk more about later, for the Library of Congress, the trip on which he discovered Huddie Leadbelly Ledbetter. Leadbelly, absolutely iconic blues and folk figure. He'd already lived one hell of a life by the time he crossed paths with Alan Lomax. He was convicted of murder in Texas in 1918 and sentenced to 30 years in prison, though he wrote a song pleading for a pardon and was granted one by Governor Pat Morris Neff in 1925. Okay, the whole murder thing in the Leadbelly origin story kind of gets glossed over. Do you know what did he did he actually kill someone, or was he framed?
I'm sure.
Oh.
I'm sure. No, a lot of those blues
happened?
guys, several of those blues guys were murderers. Skip James said that he shot a guy in a logging camp, I think, at one point.
Just to watch him die?
Possibly. Who else? I was just thinking of R.L. Burnside, who I mentioned earlier, who's thanks to Fat Possum Records, became one of the more visible rediscovered Southern blues artists in the late 90s, early 2000s. He played with John Spencer Blues Explosion, and he shot a man. He mentions it on camera at one point in this documentary. It was a rough and tumble time, man. All of these guys were just I've read a lot about the Delta Blues, and it's fascinating because some of them really only had learned a handful of songs. They were not jazz musicians or thought of themselves as musicians in any particular sense. Music was just such a part of the culture that they would just pick up a couple songs that they would learn from either other musicians or just by being around them and kind of perform them either as party tricks or cobbled together a set and would play that. But, none of this really paid because all of it was for house parties on the different work farms or plantations that were I mean, I guess they weren't called plantations. They were work farms after the Civil War, but same difference. And yeah, I mean, otherwise they were just like working in logging camps, or some of them were just professional gamblers. I mean, it was really a rough and tumble milieu. It's certainly not Miles Davis going to Juilliard, situation. So no, I have no doubt that Leadbelly actually killed someone. Maybe more than one person.
Are there any ethical implications we should touch on with that, or just guy had it coming?
Well, I mean, how much an entire dissertation's worth? I mean, the South at this point was just still Reconstruction era, right? And so the cards were heavily stacked against all these guys trying to get out of the sharecropping situation. And as Dave Chappelle famously said, you better learn how to dance or play basketball or somehow learn how to entertain these white folks if you want to get out of here. But they were violent situations, man. And Angola, where Leadbelly in Louisiana, where Leadbelly wound up at one point, was hell on earth. It's a famously horrifying prison. And it's incredibly sad. And a lot of them, as we'll touch later, were still languishing in obscurity. I mean, I didn't really touch on it in this episode, but basically, in tandem with a lot of this stuff, there were people who were just fans of this music who would just, John Fahey is a huge one, who would just go drive through the South and ask for what were called race records and pick up stuff for their collections. And it was dangerous back then. I mean, they would get chased out of neighborhoods just because Alan Lomax got in trouble just because he had a giant Library of Congress seal on his van. And people were just like, who is this white man coming down from the government, like asking about us? But yeah, I mean, it was a tough time. It was horrifically impoverished and alcohol abuse everywhere. And so much of this music that has become foundational to American history and deified in a sort of remote way. People don't really understand how terrible life was for a lot of these guys. So, I bear them no grudges as far as murders.
When the Lomaxes found Leadbelly, he was serving time in Louisiana's notorious Angola Penitentiary, as you just mentioned. They recorded him in 1933 and 1934 and sent the recordings to Louisiana Governor Oscar K. Allen, petitioning for Leadbelly's release. Some have claimed that Leadbelly was due to be released anyway due to good behavior, but I think print the legend in this case.
Yeah, it makes a better story.
Yeah.
Oh, here it is. Leadbelly shot and killed Will Stafford in December 1917 while on the run from the law.
Will Stafford. So, was he a cop?
Nope. Leadbelly insulted his girlfriend. Stafford drew first.
Okay.
Yeah. Classic.
Jesus.
Continue.
Leadbelly ended up driving John Lomax around for 3 months, helping him with his folk song collecting before making a go of things as a singer himself. Despite what you've described as an astonishingly racist Life magazine article and championing by Native Son author Richard Wright, Leadbelly actually landed in prison again in 1939, at which point Alan Lomax took him under his wing and secured him radio show appearances and live bookings. I imagine he got him out of prison?
I believe he was just actually released this time, but like to the recognizance of John Lomax.
Whoa.
That Life, I cannot read the title of that Life pictorial. It uses the hard R.
What? Send me a link to that.
Oh yeah, one of the craziest details I forgot about Leadbelly is that his throat was almost cut. He was playing a dance and someone stuck a knife in his neck and almost completely cut his throat. And I remember this detail about him was that people said it was from like a botched hanging, but it was a knife wound.
Before he started his singing career or after?
No, this was at a gig, essentially.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I mean, that's the
Wow.
thing, man. These roadhouses were tough.
I've seen Roadhouse.
Tar paper shacks, like just the place where they were playing these. I mean, the songs, and there's, I forget one of them. It might be Mississippi Fred McDowell or maybe Bucka White, but one of them talks about being like 11 and knowing like very little guitar, but just having people be like, no, it's a dance. You have to keep playing. And they would just keep giving him shots to keep going and these would go to like dawn.
What did you just say? A tar paper factory?
Tar Paper Shack.
Tar paper shack. I guess it's what it says on the tin.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yep.
Wow.
Yeah.
Until his death in 1944, Leadbelly continued to record and perform across the U.S. His final concert was at the University of Texas at Austin in tribute to John Lomax, Alan's father, who died the previous year. Leadbelly's songs Midnight Special and Goodnight Irene have become folk standards, and he was rediscovered in the early 90s when Kurt Cobain name-checked him during Nirvana's MTV Unplugged performance when he covered his song Where Did You Sleep Last Night, also known as In the Pines.
Yeah, Leadbelly and Woody Guthrie sang that together, I think, on a radio program at one point.
That is a great performance when Kurt does it. I've not heard Leadbelly's.
I mean, it sounds dated in a way. I mean, it's much less purposefully haunting and a little more jaunty, but he was an incredible musician. I mean, he played a 12-string guitar primarily, and he finger-picked it. And having one here that I don't play, it's hard to finger-pick on a 12-string. It's hard to play a 12-string, period, unless you're just kind of sweeping through the strings, because it's such a damn pain in the ass to have all of them. But yeah, he's a tremendous guitar player, singer. He also played like a squeeze box. There's pictures of him with like a little accordion. What's all this about folk song collecting? You get a water, I'll continue. Folk song collecting is one of the weirder phrases in the annals of American history. The job, process, vocation, whatever you want to call it, dates back to 1926, when a guy named Robert Winslow Gordon pitched the Library of Congress's music division director, who was a guy named Carl Engel, on a folk music collecting project that would allow him to continue the work he'd been doing researching and archiving folk music from San Francisco and Oakland in the early 1900s. That's right, folks. There was a time when your government cared about culture and art and not what are they up to now? F-16s? This was part of the Works Progress Administration spending. In 1928, Engel was concerned that the advent of industrialization, technology like radio and the phonograph, meant that America was going to be losing its more niche musical cultures, and he established the Archive of American Folk Song at the Library of Congress with Gordon as its chair. With these funds, Gordon expanded his range of collecting from the Bay Area to Georgia, and later Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky. However, the Great Depression caused the project to fall by the wayside in 1932 when funds from the government and private sectors dried up. Shortly after Gordon left, though, John Lomax independently visited the archive to consult its collections for his book, American Ballads and Folk Song. This is Alan's dad. While there, he struck a deal with Engel that he'd receive a phonograph and wax cylinder recording blanks from the Library of Congress in exchange for donating all of his recordings to the archive. Lomax, and basically his whole family, he took his kids and wife along with these, started these forays into the South from this time. They focused on Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, South Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia. Fun fact, because the government has always been cheapskates, Lomax worked with the Library of Congress for over a decade and kept the title of honorary curator until his death, but he was never on payroll. The Library of Congress expected him to make ends meet through grants and his lecture circuit earnings. In 1936, though, Alan Lomax became the archive's first official employee and was given both the title of assistant in charge and an annual salary of $620. He expanded the reach of the project to Haiti and the Bahamas and brought in Woody Guthrie, with whom he wrote and co-hosted American Folk Songs, which was a 26-week radio broadcast by CBS. Things at the archive ramped up in 1940 when they secured a grant from the Carnegie Corporation, which allowed them to install a recording studio and started producing recordings in 1941 that include some of the earliest issued folk music anthologies in the U.S. Alan Lomax expanded the reach of the archive by essentially offering the same deal that John got: we'll give you the equipment if you give us the songs, to any local folk music researchers. Which is really a key step in expanding this outside of the immediate reach of the Library of Congress. The context of the folklore wing gradually started to shift and started including things like oral history and photography projects, which are all still on the website and are all amazing. Some incredible photography it continued up through the 70s at the behest of this Folklife Center. And then, like I mentioned, letters and drawings and all this ephemera. It's a little too granular even for us to get into how it got away from being specifically folk music. But by 1976, President Ford signed the American Folklife Preservation Act, which formally brought the folk song archive under the broad umbrella of the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress. As of 2018, the Archive of Folk Culture encompasses 2,700 collections that contain 150,000 sound recordings and over 3 million items total. It branches into oral histories conducted with former slaves, specific oral histories, photographs based around particular cities. There's one on Paterson, New Jersey that I was particularly taken with. And it's all online for free. So for anyone who is interested in American history, it is an invaluable research. Big ups to the Library of Congress.
Your beloved Library of Congress.
My beloved Library of Congress. I don't know, man. Like, the government used to care about this kind of They weren't always just inventing magic numbers and throwing them at genocide or, blowing up brown people. They were, like, invested in culture,
We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back with more Too Much Information in just a moment.
Anyway, when people talk about Alan Lomax, they usually talk about his so-called Southern journey that took place from 1959 to 1960 throughout Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. Lomax had fled the U.S. for much of the 50s because of the McCarthy-era witch hunts and their particular fondness for targeting folky types. Upon his return in 1957 and witnessing the nascent folk music boom in and around Greenwich Village in New York City, for which he was partially responsible, he recoiled. As he wrote in a letter, some of the young folkniks who dominated the New York scene asserted that there was more folk music in Washington Square on Sunday afternoon than there was in all of rural America. Apparently, it made them feel like heroes to believe they were keeping a dying tradition alive. The idea that these nice young people, who were only just beginning to learn how to play and sing in good style, might replace the glories of the real thing, frankly, horrified me.
Good for him.
Yes.
This is what I hate about the folk revival. I mean, other than the fact that it did spawn so much great music and people who were genuinely interested in it, it also spawned garbage like the Kingston Trio and all these clowns who were just wearing like ice cream shirts.
Tom Dooley.
Yeah. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley. Like, just completely whitewashing it and making it the most. I mean, I just talked about how all this stuff was like forged in blood and dirt. And you got these clowns up there singing like immaculate 3-part harmonies about murder. They're like, how do you make songs about murder boring and milquetoast? And white people did it so well.
I just interviewed a bunch of the Beach Boys, and Al Jardine, one of the Beach Boys, he's the guy who brought Sloop John B. to Brian Wilson to do, which is one of the big Beach Boys hits off of Pet Sounds. He knew it through the Kingston Trio, and the Kingston Trio knew it as an old like Caribbean sea shanty song.
Do you know where they got it?
No, where?
Alan Lomax, dude.
Well, sure, yeah, that's what I'm implying.
Yeah,
you can trace the lineage from.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. This is hilarious. In 1935, Lomax flew from Florida to Nassau in the Bahamas, where he started doing recording of the island, particularly the sponge fishers of Cat Island, it says in his biography. And then they were told to leave because they were suspected of being labor agitators. But some of the songs that they got from this were I Bid You Good Night, which was famously sung by the Grateful Dead at the close of all of their classic lineup shows. And in the vernacular, this song is actually titled Heast or Hoist Up the John B. Sail. Anyway, sorry, you were talking about the Beach Boys, as you always do?
Well, Alan Lomax had a desire to correct this, and he pitched Atlantic Records to equip and fund his next journey, which would be his shortest at just 2 months long. But Lomax was no longer toting around a phonograph and wax cylinders. He was now armed with a more modern Ampex 601 reel-to-reel tape recorder, a mixer, and external microphones like an RCA D77, a ribbon microphone that now goes for between $2,000 and $3,000, and an Altec lipstick mic that also goes for up to like $2,000 now. And all of this weighed about 300 pounds, so it wasn't easy.
I mean, really, yeah, really incredible. And some of those, I mean, it just goes to show how much you can do with good analog equipment. I mean, some of those recordings are still just beautiful stuff.
Atlantic Records' stake in the project included a 7 LP collection named the Southern Folk Heritage Series in 1960. The 12 LP Southern Journey series for Prestige International Records was also taken from this trip. Of course, the tracks included were guided by the music industry. Liner notes for reissues of the Atlantic set see Lomax admitting the set reflects to some extent what the Erdoğans, Ahmet and Nushi, the founders of Atlantic Records, felt might best reach their pop audience.
Lomax, to his credit, attempted to break a few of these subjects as part of the folk revival. He booked singers like Almeda Riddle, Hobart Smith, Ed Young, and Bessie Jones, whose voice turns up in Moby's work, at the Newport Folk Festival in 1964. Mississippi Fred McDowell was probably the biggest beneficiary of this journey. He was able to, because of his genial and affable nature and tremendous songs and fingerpicking, he was able to make a living from live performances on the back of this this quote unquote rediscovery. It's funny, I read a biography of Skip James, who was actually rediscovered by John Fahey. John Fahey and his buddy got Skip James out of a hospital by paying his hospital bill. And John Fahey, true to form, because he was an ass, would for years afterwards say, I bought Skip James. But yeah, there's a fascinating biography about Skip James called I'd Rather Be the Devil, which is the name of one of his tunes. And that guy was prickly. He was not a pleasant man by all accounts, and consequently did not really make an affable pop singer the way that Mississippi Fred McDowell did. Anyway, back to Vincent Van Mobe. Play was produced on mostly secondhand equipment at Moby's Mott Street home studio in Manhattan, New York, from August 1997 through 1998. Altogether, I worked on it for a year, he told Chaos Control back in 1999. I mixed it there, then I wasn't happy with it. Then I went to one outside studio to mix it, went to another outside studio, and then I ended up coming back here and doing the mixing myself. So I wasted a lot of time and money. He also told the site that Play's tracklist was whittled down to 18 from around 200 to 300 songs. Ultimately, Play tracks Honey, Find My Baby, and Natural Blues were, air quotes, composed by Moby around vocal hooks sampled from songs in the Lomax collection. These are respectively by Bessie Jones, her recording of Sometimes, Boy Blue from Jolie's Rock, and Vera Hall Ward from Trouble So Hard. Another Play track, Why Does My Heart Feel So Bad, is lifted from a song called He'll Roll Your Burdens Away by the Banks Brothers and the Greater Harvest Back Home Choir of Newark, New Jersey, originally released in 1966 on Savoy. And lastly, Run On uses Bill Lanford and the Lanfordaires' 1949 rendition of the traditional folk hymn, God's Gonna Cut You Down. Lanford had been a member of the Golden Gate Quartet, which are actually very influential in the history of the development of gospel music. The 4-part vocal structure of what we consider the golden age of gospel quartets, like the ones that Sam Cooke started in, the Soul Stirrers, evolved out of what they call these Jubilee quartets, which are actually kind of alien to us sounding, because they were much more concerned with like tight, what we would consider like barbershop style harmonies. And they were based out of colleges. Some of the first all-black colleges launched these Jubilee quartets. Moby said, Run On was one of the first songs written, emphasis mine. And it was really hard to put together because it had so many samples in it. I didn't use computers at that point. It was all done with standalone samplers. He also claimed to have no idea that God's Gonna Cut You Down was one of the 20th century's most well-known gospel and country standards. There are versions out there by Odetta, Elvis, Johnny Cash, Marilyn Manson, and Tom Jones, among others.
Which one of those people is deepest in hell?
It's going to be Marilyn Manson when that finally happens. But, man. Oh, this might be a recent cover, actually.
My favorite Tom Jones cover is this incredible version of Talking Heads, Burning Down the House, with Nina, I forget her last name, from the Cardigans.
The Cardigans. Wither the Cardigans. The Johnny Cash one is probably my favorite. It's off the American series, and it genuinely sounds haunting. And so, of course, it's been used in like truck ads by now. God, this
I mean,
stupid
Tom
country.
Jones kind of rips.
Some of his latter work, as we talked about in Mars Attacks. Did we do Mars Attacks?
We never did Mars Attacks.
How the f were we talking about Tom Jones at one point? Because we were talking about how his later career is actually quite interesting.
I don't remember ever talking about that. You sure that wasn't a text conversation with Dave Long from the pod Dave Long?
Or Fugue State?
Yeah, you just like talking to your dog.
Yeah, probably. Moby wrote Honey.
Axel, Tom Jones's later works.
That's, dude,
Please feed me.
not an exaggeration. Moby wrote Honey in, quote, about 10 minutes, he told Rolling Stone in 2009. Gosh, I wonder why it was so easy for you to write. Perhaps because, never mind.
Someone else wrote it.
Yeah. My girlfriend at the time really liked it, he continued. And that surprised me because she didn't really like my music. I'm wondering if, in his mind, this is Natalie Portman. Old Moby Doby Doo famously claimed to have dated her in 1999. He wrote a memoir in which he claimed this, and Portman publicly shut it down, recalling the incident as a, quote, much older man being creepy with me when I had just graduated high school. In a classic celebrity bungle, Moby doubled down and followed the template that's been in place since time immemorial. He posted proof, which was a picture of them where he's shirtless, and then he said people should be paying more attention to climate change, and then he apologized.
The picture is great because it looks like
he just took his shirt off in a room with Natalie Portman?
like backstage. Yeah, and she looks visibly uncomfortable.
Oy.
The track Find My Baby, Moby told Rolling Stone, was, quote, basically just me playing slide guitar over a vocal sample. I added what I thought were hip-hop drums to it. In the 80s, I was DJing a lot of hip-hop. At one point, I was working at Manhattan's Mars Bar, and I used to keep a microphone by the turntables. Big Daddy Kane and Run DMC and Third Bass and Flavor Flav, and everybody would go down to this club and get drunk, and I had the microphone. I was the weird white DJ for all these rappers who were drinking and rapping to impress their girlfriends.
Shut up.
Okay, man.
He's just, everything out of his mouth is just off-putting in some way. It's really astounding. Why Does My Heart Feel So Bad? Quote, was written in 92 as a bad techno song, Moby continued. Some might argue, did it change?
It's the American Coronary Association's theme song.
It really?
No.
Oh, it wouldn't surprise me. You could throw a dart at something in the late 90s and a Moby track was probably associated with it.
The American Coronary Association, an organization I just made up, would not have a theme song. Why Does My Heart Feel So Bad?
I think you underestimate the stupidity of marketing and ad people, Jordan.
Yeah.
He said, just mediocre, generic techno. At some point, I rediscovered the song, and I tried doing it considerably slower, tried to make it mournful and romantic. 2 of these songs were pushed for inclusion on Play by Moby's managers, he added. My manager, Barry, talked me into including Porcelain, and my other manager, Eric, talked me into including Why Does My Heart Feel So Bad? Lastly, Natural Blues is built around Vera Hall Ward's immortal Trouble So Hard, as basically its entire melody. This one kind of is probably the most egregious to me, and not just because I liked it the most, but he just takes her whole performance, man. It's the whole melody of the song, which is really like, and we'll get into copyright law and this weird stuff later, but it like actually gets to the point of how do you own a copyright on something? Because you can't copyright a chord progression, right? But you can a melody. So he just added like an undergirding of beats and synth washes to an existing melody, and it's his song. F off, Richard.
You got to do it in the John Hurt voice.
F off, Richard. Natural Blues. What's
we
that?
we don't talk much about Porcelain in this episode, which is kind of the only song I knew originally of this.
Let's see what where he stole Porcelain from. No, he did write this. Oh, nope, I was wrong. A reversed sample of strings from the Ernest Gold composition Fight for Survival from his soundtrack to the 1960 film Exodus.
Oh, that's cool.
Porcelain was prominently sampled on rapper A$AP Rocky's 2018 A$AP Forever. ASAP, Rocky. I guess you got to read the whole thing out, like A Tribe Called Quest. John Lomax, the elder Lomax, had met Ward, who was born in Alabama in 1902. He recorded her for the Library of Congress in the 1930s, saying she had one of his favorite voices he'd ever recorded. Later, the Library of Congress played this song in commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1937, almost 60 years to the date when a nebbishy white guy would steal it.
Ooh, Lord, ain't my trouble so hard. Ooh, Lord, ain't my trouble so hard. Don't nobody know my trouble but God. Don't nobody know my trouble but God. Went down the hill the other day. Soul got happy and stayed all day. Ooh, Lordy.
Some of Ward's recordings were released as an album called Cornbread, Crumbled, and Gravy. Another Man Done Gone became Vera Hall's most celebrated performance and was a particular favorite of poet and Lincoln biographer Carl Sandburg, right? That's what Carl Sandburg's deal is. It's all the Lincoln biographies.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Alan Lomax helped secure Ward a booking in 1948 at Columbia University. He later wrote of her voice, "The sound comes from deep within her when she sings, from a source of gold and light, otherwise hidden, and falls directly upon your ear like sunlight." And Hall died in January of 1964 in Tuscaloosa, Alabama.
Play was released to relatively muted reception in May 1999 after having been rejected by every major label until Richard Branson picked it up on his V2 imprint. Moby said that his publicist sent the record to journalists, and many of them pointedly wrote back saying that they weren't even going to listen to it. He recalled, "The first show that I did on the tour for Play was in the basement of the Virgin Megastore in Union Square, literally playing music while people were waiting in line buying CDs. Maybe 40 people came."
Have you seen that Virgin Megastore videos with Dillinger Escape Plan where the guy just crowd runs over the
No.
audience in the first 2 seconds of the song? It's incredible.
Oh, I used to go to that Virgin Megastore all the time. They were great because they were open past midnight. So
Nice.
you would go in there like 12:01 and buy whatever album you couldn't wait. Remember how exciting that was when you knew somebody's about to drop a new album? And I guess they still do it, but it's not the same when you're just refreshing Spotify.
I don't think I was
You
even
never
buying...
did that?
No, I stopped buying new CDs out of financial necessity in high school. I just went to the CD warehouse and bought used stuff. God, what was the last album that I was excited about coming out? It might have been something... No, I mean, I still buy new stuff, but it's mostly for the vinyl release. I don't pre-save things or whatever.
So given this low turnout to the Virgin Megastore basement performance, expectations were low for Play. Moby really just wanted to sell as much or slightly more than his biggest hit, Everything Is Wrong, which would have amounted to slightly over 200,000 copies. Narrator voice, he would sell a lot more. But it took some time. In fact, it didn't do much on the charts for the better part of a year. He would later say, almost a year after it came out in 2000, I was opening up for Bush on an MTV Campus Invasion tour. It was degrading for the most part. Their audience had less than no interest in me. February in 2000, I was in Minnesota. I was depressed, and my manager called me to tell me that Play was #1 in the UK, and it beat out Santana's Supernatural. I was like, but the record came out 10 months ago.
What a shitty f***ing year for music.
I mean, have you checked the charts lately?
Yeah.
That's when I knew all of a sudden that things were different. Then it was #1 in France and Australia and Germany. It just kept piling on. The week Play was released, he continued, it sold worldwide about 6,000 copies. 11 months after Play was released, it was selling 150,000 copies a week. I was on tour constantly, drunk pretty much the entire time, and it was just a blur. And then all of a sudden, movie stars started coming to my concerts, and I started getting invited to fancy parties, and suddenly the journalists who wouldn't return my publicist's calls were talking about doing cover stories. It was a really odd phenomenon.
He's so spiteful, and I understand it. I'm a hypocrite for pointing out anyone's spite, but I will also point out he achieved success. He made it, man. And he's still whinging constantly.
But he also achieved success earlier than that too, but he just didn't like it and willfully drove his career into a mountainside.
Yeah, man. It's like the Replacements. I mean, that Bob Mayer biography, like, kind of made me like them less because they got all these opportunities. Like, you know, the log line with the Replacements is tremendously talented band who sabotaged their every chance at success. But they did that in tremendously stupid ways. Like, they were recording up in the Catskills and they wanted to play upright bass on a song. So someone got them an upright bass, like from that was presumably a nice upright bass to use in the studio, and they smashed it. They used to burn their per diems, which were $100 a day. Do you know what a per diem today is for like a touring musician? And this was like in the late 80s, early 90s.
I'm sure it's like 50.
Yeah.
Today.
If you're lucky. So yeah, man, I'm just like, this generation musician were just like, God, you babies.
Talk about David Crosby, Heigl. My friend David Crosby.
Yeah, your close personal friend David Crosby. People live in their goddamn vans to like make music now. And you got all these chuds notching sales numbers that no one would ever see again and crying into their offshore accounts over it. Also, your family's like historically famous. You're telling me there wasn't like trust fund money for him? There's streets named after your family in New York. Like
the Crosby Street is named after Crosby's family?
No, it's not. You know, it's his family.
I know his dad was a cinematographer, an Oscar-winning cinematographer.
Van Cortlandt is his middle name.
Oh, yeah.
His mom was a Van Cortlandt.
Right. That's right. Forgot about that.
And also his dad was not like some laboring in obscurity filmmaker. He won an Oscar.
He won an Oscar. I know.
He's a cinematographer on High Noon. Where were we? You should cut a lot of that because otherwise I'm going to get more comments calling me like a stereotypical music major. Even though, once again, I minored in music. I majored in English. I'm pretentious for a different reason.
We got a nice comment the other day.
On Apple Podcasts?
Yeah, McHoltz1. Hilarious, funny, and very interesting. I've been binge listening to all the episodes. Fantastic podcast and very well done.
Aw.
Yeah.
That's nice.
Yeah, we've been getting
the guy who gave us 1 star because there are ads in it. You're going to give us 1 star because we run ads and you're going to bitch about like artistic purity? F off. Find that guy's IP address. Visit him so I can explain him my passions.
Do you see?
That's actually a Russell Crowe bit.
Oh, is it?
My favorite Russell
really?
Crowe. My favorite Russell Crowe tweet of all, maybe my favorite celebrity tweet of all time. I think he's tweeting about climate change, and someone is like, "Stick to acting, homeboy," or something. And Russell Crowe's response tweet is simple facts. 1, I'm not your boy. 2, like climate change is real or something. Send me your home address so I can visit you and explain my passions. Like my favorite threat of all time. Visit you and explain my passions from an Australian? That's terrifying. As you meditate on that, we'll be right back with more Too Much Information after these messages.
Oh, now we're going to talk about Gap ads.
Oh, yeah. This will really keep my blood pressure at a dull roar. This was helped. The sales figures were helped by one of the most successful sync campaigns in the history of music, which eventually saw every single song on play licensed for use in film,
That's
TV,
insane.
or commercials. Wired magazine called the campaign, quote, a licensing venture so staggeringly lucrative that the album was a financial success months before it reached its multi-platinum sales total. Also, it eventually sold 12 million copies worldwide. Didn't even need these syncs. I mean, arguably the syncs helped, blah, blah, blah. Is the best-selling electronic album of all time. Moby himself could be seen in ads for The Gap, and he appeared at the Salt Lake City Olympics, which is the whitest sentence of all time. This strategy actually dated back to the Go era. Moby's managers, Marcy Weber and Barry Taylor, recalled the huge splash that Moby's atmospheric God moving over the face of the waters I actually like that song quite a bit, which soundtracked the climax to Michael Mann's Heat in 1995, had made in the film scoring industry. So they, quote, invited every music supervisor in Hollywood to a party and dinner during the independent Slam Dance Festival in 1996 to try and tap that market. So then when Play came around, Barry Taylor told Wired, we made a conscious effort to create a marketing plan that had nothing to do with radio. Consequently, Porcelain played on behalf of Bailey's Irish Cream and Nordstrom, Find My Baby for American Express. On April 20th, 2000, almost 11 months after the album's release, the producers of a British television program faxed a request to use the lone album track that hadn't yet been licensed. No one actually expected Seven, a brief, unremarkable bit of incidental music, to be purchased. When the fax arrived, Barry Taylor recalled, we celebrated. David Steele, head of special projects, including licensing at Moby's label V2, told the New York Times in 2001, it was very short-lived, but we made a lot of money. In all, he told the paper they signed over 100 licenses in North America alone, for which Moby's cut was, as of March 2001, around $1 million.
That's it?
It seems low.
Yeah.
Go to the customary inflation calculator.
All right, so like 2.3 million. That still sounds low.
I don't know, dude, 2.3 million from 100 syncs? What does that break down to? Like
10,000 a sync?
That's about right. I mean, because this was also kind of the nascent era of that, really. I mean, a lot of ad campaigns were probably using library and stock music at the time.
It costs like $7,000 to get a song for the Paul Anka podcast, like an old standard. For a podcast. We didn't have the rights to put it on social.
Because people got smarter about it. They wisened up. This was kind of the Wild West of it, really. Per that New York Times article.
Moby would tell Hot Press magazine, when I licensed the music from Play, the goal was simply to get people to hear the music. Most of the licenses weren't particularly lucrative, but they enabled people to hear the music because otherwise that record wasn't being heard. In a different interview, he split some hairs about the every song was licensed thing. It's a misleading truth, he told American Songwriter in 2005. Yes, every song was licensed, but some of the songs were licensed to tiny independent film productions that were never seen by anyone. One of the songs was licensed for an Australian student film by some guy in college in Sydney. He continued, Play became successful in Los Angeles before it became successful anywhere else. We started getting licensing requests for movies and TV shows, and then it just took off from there. The early adopters were music supervisors in Los Angeles. When opportunities to get the music heard came along, we jumped at them. At that time, there was really no radio support. That informed all the licensing, anything we could do to try to get more people to hear the music. Heigl, as a very principled musician, how do you feel about that strategy?
I mean, again, at the time, for a guy who was already like a live draw and a semi-famous musician, like, yeah, that's a little annoying, but also, as I mentioned later, very prescient. Nobody makes any money nowadays except from touring and licensing. So obviously that conversation is disintegrated, but you know, it's interesting. He's so defensive about it, man. I was reading this interview where he was like, he talked about playing in punk and hardcore bands. And he was like, where I was playing in those bands, some people considered playing a show to be selling out. Some people considered making a record to be selling out. So there's always been those hardliners, but I don't know, man. 100 syncs for 18 songs is aggressive. Like, that's wild.
That's a lot.
Yeah, man. I mean, it's fine. It's not some like come from behind story. It's not like some unsigned guy. He had Richard Branson's label doing this for him. Like, come on, man. It's not an indie band that made their career off a single sync in an iPod commercial back in the day. I mean, he had a multi-million-dollar corporation doing this placement for him. He had 2 managers. Like, there's nothing grassroots or independent about that at this point, which is kind of the justification. It's just a rich white dude getting richer. Did you ever read that thing in his memoir about Lana Del Rey?
No.
He was like trying to, you know, boink her and
in the biblical sense.
In the biblical sense, yeah. And they were in his apartment, and I think he wanted to like play her a song or something, but he was like, oh, that's on my other floor, or like the hard drive or laptop is on the other floor of my apartment. And she was like, you know, you're the man. And he said it took him a second to realize she didn't mean that as a compliment. She meant that he, as like a straight white musician with a 2-floor apartment in downtown Manhattan, was like the system. And he was like, and that kind of took me aback. was like, yeah, dude. I don't know, man. It's such a thorny conversation, and like, I've given up on it, man. Like, I would kill for a sync for any of my music right now. You know, it'd be great. Any song, anyone, even the bad ones.
Especially the bad ones.
Especially the bad ones. Yeah, but it's just like, yeah, it rankles a bit. And I think the reason that this pisses me off the most is that, you know, none of these people knew who Vera Hallward was. He didn't even thank them in the liner notes. He never even named these people. He thanks Alan Lomax in the liner notes.
The white guy who found it.
Yeah. You know, so that's why I think it leaves the worst taste in my mouth, man.
Have you ever invited a girl over to your house to play her a song you wrote?
No. I usually did that when I went to their house and they had a guitar.
Fair.
Also in that interview, Moby talks about his drinking days, which inspired me to go on this tangent. He said, once when I was in Belgrade, I got drunk with all these ex-soldiers who introduced me to concrete. Basically, you take half a pint beer and pour in a load of vodka. The weird thing is it tastes really good. He also contends he had a wild night out with Tommy Lee and Pantera's Dimebag Darrell, during which at the end they all decided to start a band together. And then Dimebag was murdered. I investigated this drink concrete, and I found it in a Wikipedia entry for it in Russian, where it is called yorsh, which translates to a little spiky fish. I don't know where he got concrete. Maybe that's the Serbian.
Well, because wasn't he in the band A Wall? Maybe that's part of it.
Ha ha.
Congratulations, it's the worst joke of the show.
Callback.
Callback.
Comedy. Timing. Heigl, you know what the most important part of comedy is?
You say it.
Timing.
Anyway, yorsh. Friend of the pod, yorsh. That is a hardcore alcoholic drink, I will tell you. Vodka in beer.
It sounds like awful, too.
I guess don't they do that with vodka? They do it in the UK. They call it a snake bite. Vodka and cider. Anyway, many people seem to think that we pitched the music for ads only. Moby's UK manager Eric Heigl told Hitmaster.com in 2003. Whereas the truth is that we just responded to the requests. The ads we selected were very carefully chosen, and we actually turned down more than we accepted. It is also somewhat hypocritical to label Moby the ad guy when most of his music was really used in film and television, and the advertising usage was fairly limited. I'm going to still label him the ad guy. Moby and his management were, in the rearview mirror, exceptionally ahead of their time in pimping play out to whoever fancied a go. Whoever fancied a bit of a knees up with her.
Oh, wow. No, it's knee trembler, first of all. Knees up is a dance.
A knee trembler? That's interesting. The album came out literally 2 weeks before the launch of Napster signaled the end of the music industry as people know it, and nobody would be balking at licensing songs once Spotify hit the US about a decade later, and, not content with simply beating the corpse of the music industry, set about defiling it. If you were Swedish, you owe us an apology for Daniel Ek. Just a note to any of our listeners. However, Play's engagement with and or straight up theft of black people's literal voices to craft platinum-selling car commercials hasn't aged particularly well. It's worth noting that of the first 5 singles released from Play, 4 of them were based on this rubric. Oh, and one of the album's B-sides, Flower, was also lifted from a Lomax recording. In this case, Green Sally Up, as performed by Maddie Gardner, Mary Gardner, and Jessie Lee Pratcher. Oh, and also Play's closing track, My Weakness, contains a manipulated sample of a vocal performance of Dance Ni Windigako Di Tiga, a traditional Kanak song performed by the indigenous people of Tiga Island near Malaysia, recorded by a French ethnomusicologist. Asked for the source of the sample in 2001 on his website, Moby said, I don't know. It's in some strange African dialect, so I have no idea what's being said. Obviously, Africa and Malaysia are different places.
Hilariously, at least one person tried to warn Moby about all this appropriation. He told the New York Times that when playing early versions of the Play material for friends, one said he should be cautious. The fact that I was a white kid from the 20th century sampling African American vocals from the early 20th century had never even crossed my mind, he said. In the long, non-illustrious history of white people pilfering African American culture, have I just perpetrated that? I'm motivated by a love of the music and by a love of the performances, and I really hope I haven't done anything bad. Narrator voice. He just perpetrated that. Moby told Rolling Stone that he considered Natural Blues his favorite of Play's singles, but added, "It almost didn't make it on the record. I had some friends over, and I was playing them songs off the record, and they thought it was just too weird." You have a point about this.
Well, it's unclear if it was the same friend with an understanding of racial dynamics in both instances. If you or a loved one warned Moby about using black people's voices to make music to shop for khakis to, TMI wants to hear from you.
No, we don't.
Yeah, we don't actually. You know, man, appropriation is especially thorny in music, right? Because that's the history of music. I mean, jazz, America's only native art form, other than burlesque, comes from the literal marriage of African rhythms and pitch blending with European harmony and European instruments, right? So that's what I find so truly fascinating about it and this country. But you look confused.
No, I was just trying to think of other elements of black culture that have been appropriated more than just in the last 40 or so years. I mean, black fashion more recently.
Yeah, everything. Black fashion, rapping, even DJ culture is black from Jamaica originally, and then the Bronx.
It's interesting that of all the things, like I can't think of like pilfering, like I'm making this up, but like black painting styles, for example. Like it's interesting that music is the thing that we tend to raid from that culture.
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of that breaks down into access. I mean, a lot of the black artists who were familiar in the popular consciousness, like Basquiat, God, I can't name very many others, but it was an access issue, man.
Yeah.
I mean, some of the people who you see in art museums as black artists, Kehinde Wiley, Barack Obama's portraitist, famously. I named two. How about that? I'm one of the good white people.
You're an ally.
No, but I think it was an access issue. I mean, a lot of these guys weren't given the opportunity to pursue the arts in any way until the GI Bill, you know? If you go to like a lot of big Afro art exhibits post-war, a lot of them are ex-GIs who were able to do that, and then a lot of the pre-war stuff is slotted into sort of like the American primitivist styles, or it's like, you know, Bill Traylor's one of them, who's this guy who just like painted on garbage because that was the only like scrap wood, you know, and it became a celebrated outsider artist, or it's slotted into that somewhat ghettoizing term of outsider art. Dehumanizing term, literally othering term, outsider art, you know. Yeah, but music is so thorny, man. I mean, Miles Davis's bands were extremely integrated. Charlie Parker's bands were integrated. They didn't care as long as people could play. And I think that is beautiful, but I also think the conversation around it has evolved to the point that if you're going to do this, like, at least give credit. And he doesn't. He doesn't. He confused Malaysian people for African people. Like, he thanks Alan Lomax, again, in the goddamn liner notes, does not name any of these women, does not name any of these artists. Like, it's just lazy, man. I mean, thanking the straight white guy who himself, you know, profited off of these people's voices and not thank those people is galling. I really have a problem with that. And it's bad enough that, like, you know, if you're playing rock music at all or anything derived from rock music, as I have most of my life, and even studying jazz, like, certainly, like, you're in debt to black people. I'm sorry, you are, but rock and roll would not exist without the blues, and the backbeat is essentially, like, taken from the clave, which is an Afro-Caribbean rhythm. Like, you don't get any music except for, like, Western classical and pure Appalachian folk without black people, man, and writing them out of these massive successes. Not just 12 million copies sold, but the collective impact that this made on culture through all of these sync licenses and everything. It's like one of the most glaring examples of whitewashing that I can actually think of ever. But also, you know, in the context, this was just kind of par for the course. I mean, Prodigy, Chemical Brothers, Fatboy Slim, Daft Punk, Portishead, all white. and all using stuff from everything from like reggae to soul, R&B, and funk deep cuts. Portishead were using a lot of so-called library music, which is music that was recorded for stock use in film and TV. The British library music has quite extensive stuff, but those were essentially white British musicians being told to produce versions of soul and jazz that were going to be free to use in TV. And this is, all part of the larger conversation that two straight white guys should not be having. But this is into the hip-hop era too, and there had been conversations about sampling in hip-hop, although they were flipped and be like, how dare these black people take songs from white people? Steely Dan successfully sued the rappers who used a sample from one of their
Peter
songs.
Guns, used Black Cow.
I think this was a little less in the conversation because at this point people were just talking about the East Coast West Coast feud and Tupac and Biggie getting shot. But, I remember Diddy getting flack for taking I'll Be Missing You essentially whole cloth, not really changing a note.
Took
and turning
money
it into,
out of Sting's pocket.
I know, right? That poor starving Sting.
Can't even afford a last name. Or a new bass.
He had to buy one less sex swing for his palatial mansion with Trudy Styler. Sorry, one fewer sex swing. The absurdity of sampling law and copyright law around this time is really illustrated very well by a case that Lomax is in fact connected to. That's right, Alan Lomax has a writing credit on Jay-Z's Takeover, which is a Nas diss track. So follow us on the musical journey. The song Takeover is based partially on a short sample from Sound of the Police by KRS-One. Whoop, whoop. It's the sound of the police. That uses a sample of Inside Looking Out by Grand Funk Railroad. However, Grand Funk were covering the Animals song of the same name. Now, the Animals based that song off of a song called Rosie, which they learned from a recording made by Alan Lomax of a chain gang at Parchment Farm, which is one of the most famous work camps in the South, musically, in 1948. And Lomax, as he did with most of these songs, and kind of a knock against him, owned the copyright to that recording. But listening to the Rosie Lomax recording, it sounds more similar to a song by Nina Simone called Be My Husband. That is, it's the exact same song, just gender flipped. And that song is technically written by her piece of husband and manager, Andrew Stroud. So he owns the copyright on a Nina Simone version of a song that was ownerless because it was sung on a work camp. And then further complicating this whole mess, the KRS-One sample is based off of an instrumental jam that Grand Funk went into as part of their cover. So, that has nothing to do with the Animals thing. That was just a jam they came up with. But Grand Funk Railroad are credited as songwriters on this Jay-Z track. And also, as I mentioned at the top of the episode, David Guetta, his song Hey Mama is also built around this Rosie vocal line. So let's trace the absurd lineage of all this shit and see if we can make any sense of copyright law. All right, here's Rosie, recorded in 1948 at Parchment Farm.
Be my woman, girl, I'll be your man. Be my woman, girl, I'll be your man. Be my woman, girl, I'll be your man. Yeah, this sun is dollar.
It's funny. The only song I know intimately of all the ones you're going to play is the Animals song.
Okay, well, here's the Animals doing Inside Looking Out.
Sit here lonely like a broken man. Serve my time and doing the best I can. Powers and balls that surrounding me, but I don't want your sympathy. Yeah.
And then covering the Animals, we have
Grand Funk. As I mentioned, though, the portion that KRS sampled comes from their jam in the middle.
and KRS-One sampled that for Sound of the Police. That's the whitest that title's ever been said.
Stand clear.
And Jay-Z sampled that for the track Takeover on 2001's The Blueprint.
That's it. Freak, wait, we running this rap. Owen Sparks, we running this rap. Chris and Neat, we running this rap. A wise man told me don't argue with fools, cause people from a distance can't tell who is who. So stop with that child, I'm grown. Please leave it alone, don't throw rocks at the throne.
And David Guetta, featuring Nicki Minaj and BB Rexa, singing the hook later. So that's from the actually Alan Lomax recording.
Yes, I be your woman. Yes, I be your baby. Yes, I be whatever that you tell me when you're ready.
Absurd, insane world we live in. Anyway, getting back to Moby. This is the grossest part of this to me. And it has not been covered. If I were making any money off this and had more time, I would reach out to Moby and the Alan Lomax archive, because the lone source that I can find for this is a Washington Post article from 2000 that suggested that the Lomax archive and Moby were in legal negotiations because they alleged that they had not seen either as much or any of the money that they should have for the licensing of these songs. Lomax was 85 and bedridden at the time after a series of strokes. So he, as we mentioned, one of the ethically dubious things that he did was hang on to these copyrights. Though, to his credit, if he had contact information for the people who recorded these songs, he was in the habit of sending them money. I mean, it could be like a $5 to $15 a year, but he did attempt to send them money from the proceeds of this. His daughter, Anna, told the Washington Post that the Lomax organization, as of printing, hadn't seen a dime from Moby, and that they had actually wanted to use this money to locate these performers or their heirs and give them some money. I'm perplexed, Anna told the paper. I'd be surprised if they didn't want to share in their good fortune with Alan and with the performers. I feel very strongly that the artists should get something out of it, or their heirs, wherever they are. Moby was not quoted in that article, but his aforementioned manager, Barry Taylor, told the Post, "We've acted responsibly. We haven't received any money ourselves for anything." What the that could even mean, other than a bold-faced lie, is unclear to me. He added that licensing fees for the Lomax samples were properly paid to a music publishing company, Warner Chappell. This is what gets interesting. I did more digging and found out that the Lomax archive was a flat fee for sampling. So there was no scalable royalties paid. They paid a flat fee for the use of these songs, presumably to Warner Chappell. And I guess the Lomax organization thought that either out of Moby's largesse or a simple understanding that these songs sold made more money than vastly out of proportion to what they paid for them, would be nice about it. Moby has tremendous respect for the Lomaxes, Taylor added. Moby was not quoted in the piece. We're optimistic that we'll be able to sort this thing out very soon. We want everyone to get paid and feel good about the project.
To date, we don't know if that's happened.
No idea.
Likely not.
No follow-up. They were in legal negotiations about it. I don't think it went to court. It was probably settled out of court, but can't find anything about it. Like I said, would have reached out to the Lomax. It probably could find, unless there's a gag order in place, although it may have expired unless it was into perpetuity. But, yeah, man, isn't that scummy and shitty? Especially considering this next graph. Jordan, take us away.
Yes, Moby continued to turn to this particular well for inspiration. He, as you wrote, snagged the Davis Sisters' 1956 record, Lord Don't Leave Me, for his song In This World, which came out on 2002's 18, his follow-up to Play. 18 also contains songs built around vocal samples from blues legend Barbara Lynn's I'm a Good Woman, and Sunday, written and performed by Sylvia Robinson, who founded Sugar Hill Records.
That's right. Sylvia Robinson, who had hits on her own as a singer in the 50s and 60s, went on to found Sugar Hill Records, responsible for launching hip-hop as a commercial concern with Rapper's Delight.
And also the 18 track, I'm Not Worried at All, samples the same Banks Brothers recording that Why Does My Heart Feel So Bad did.
Use the same damn sample twice, back to back.
And 2018's Everything Was Beautiful and Nothing Hurt a Moby album that borrows a very famous quote from Kurt Vonnegut Jr., I believe.
Correct.
Contains Like a Motherless Child, which, though sung by a contemporary singer, is a riff on the spiritual of the same name. In recent years, Moby has been pressed about the issue of cultural appropriation and has dredged up the classic "my black friend said it was okay" excuse in both an interview and on his website. He told The Scotsman in 2021, "I played some of the songs for Chris Rock, and I asked him, have I done a bad thing?" Is he
Chris
Lenny?
Rock? Chris Rock, have I done a bad thing? Yeah, right. Tell me again about the rabbits, Chris Rock.
Chris Rock looked at me and he said, no, Moby. He said, beautiful music is beautiful. He said, beautiful music is beautiful music. And he said, you've made beautiful music. Yes, you have, Moby. I felt like, okay, there's an imprimatur that comes with that from Chris Rock. He really assured me. Still, in the same interview, Moby acknowledged cultural appropriation is a real thing. Talking to Dan Weiss at Grammy.com in 2019, he made what you've described as the somewhat baffling claim, as far as I know, you asking me about cultural appropriation is the closest I've come to a conversation about it. Adding later, I'm sure if I sat down with someone like Cornel West, I'm sure they'd have a different perspective on play, and I'm sure that I'd agree with their perspective. Heigl, tell us about Cornel West.
Oh, he's a famous historian who's, I think, Harvard for the longest time, who is formerly considered, I think, something of a figurehead in African-American studies, and I think of late has gotten weirder and more reactionary in different ways. 2019, first anyone told him about cultural appropriation. No, Moby, you made beautiful music. That conversation kills me. That is like how a 14-year-old, a 10-year-old would recall something. Have I done a bad thing, Chris Rock? No, Moby, you made beautiful music. In that interview, Moby acknowledged that part of his cavalier attitude was because he assumed that play would end his career, not launch it to new, unprecedented heights. If someone had said, you're making an album that's going to sell 12 million copies, I might have given it a second thought. From the time when electronic musicians started sampling, there were only two criteria for sample-based music. Is it good? And are you gonna get sued? I'm not saying the criteria of historical sensitivity was invalid, just that it was never part of the conversation. 3 years later, though, the Coen brothers and the Lomax Archive proved how to handle this situation in a much better way. Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? The soundtrack of which was a phenomenal out-of-nowhere hit and reintroduced decades of people to Lomax's work, along with the whole sampling of American folk and blues music, famously inspiring the Mumford Brothers, so maybe we just call that one a wash. The film's title sequence is famously scored by a performance of a song called Poe Lazarus that is credited by Lomax to James Carter at, again, Parchment Farm in 1959. The soundtrack won a Grammy Award, and Lomax's daughter, Anna, true to what she said was her initial goal with the play money that allegedly never came, went on a national hunt for Carter, who had never been recorded before or after. He was eventually found at the age of 76 living in Chicago, and they gave him a royalty check for $20,000 and invited him to the Grammys. Hearing that the O Brothers soundtrack was outselling Michael Jackson and Mariah Carey records, Carter quipped, "You tell Michael I'll slow down so that he can catch up with me." He died the next year of a stroke.
We can't authoritatively rule out Joe Jackson had nothing to do with that, but
I would like to end this on an anecdote. Do you remember the name Dmitry Ehrlich from early on in this episode?
Yes, I do.
The guy who supposedly loaned Moby the Lomax collection on CD? Apparently, the CDs actually belonged to Dmitry's younger brother, Gregor, and Gregor remained haunted for this by years, as chronicled on an episode of Jonathan Goldstein's Heavyweight podcast in 2017. Dmitry, Gregor, and Moby had all been friends in their early squalorous New York days, installed at the Mars Bar, and they'd obviously lost some contact since. Gregor repeatedly asked Moby for those CDs back, though, for years. He compares the situation to being a guy who gave Shakespeare a pen once and wants the pen back. There's a lot in there about Gregor being a failed filmmaker, having something of a midlife crisis of sorts, now making films for cleaning products, as he recalled. And so he began leaving Moby voicemails, by his count, about a dozen, asking for these CDs back that all went unanswered. He wrote a song called Moby, Give Me Back My CDs, which he sang into Moby's answering machine. As part of this podcast, Goldstein and Ehrlich fly out to Burbank from New York and then drive to Moby's house. Although, in fairness, they had made an appointment with his assistant. They get in there. Gregor's whole deal is explained to Moby, at which point Moby reveals that he considered Eminem his professional nemesis and was constantly haunted by the fact that the rapper outsold him and dissed him publicly so much.
That is not related to getting this man's CDs back.
No, but he sort of reveals it as his own like midlife crisis thing. He also says at one point that somebody related to him this story of like playing natural blues at a funeral, and it was like one of the most impactful parts of her life, and that never would have happened if Gregor hadn't loaned him these CDs. But Moby says really the kick in the teeth of fame is that if you don't have it, you beat yourself up that you don't have it, and if you do have it, you're miserable and you kill yourself. Literally the most depressed I've ever been my entire life was the height of my professional success. Then, of course, he reveals that the CDs in question, he believes, are at a storage space in Queens, about as far across the country as one could get from this conversation. So Gregor leaves empty-handed. But 3 days later, he receives an email from Moby, reading in part, I realized I never said a true, heartfelt thank you for giving me those CDs. So in all sincerity, thank you. I'm sorry it's taken so long to say thank you. It's such a goddamn shame he never thanked any of those black people, though. I'm Alex Heigl, and this has been Too Much Information.
Also, I want to add, it sounds like this guy never gave him those CDs, but loaned them to Moby, who then just took them for his very own.
Little on the nose there as far as metaphors go.
And I'm Jordan Runtagh. We'll catch you next time.
Too Much Information was a production of iHeartRadio.
The show's executive producers are Noel Brown and Jordan Runtagh.
The show's supervising producer is Michael Alder June.
The show was researched, written, and hosted by Jordan Runtagh and Alex Heigl.
With original music by Seth Applebaum and the Ghost Funk Orchestra. If you like what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a review. For more podcasts on iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.